The Embera refugee camp is in the Mauritania Desert in West Africa. It houses more than 115,000 residents. The camp is so large that it's actually Mauritania's second largest city.
Everyone lives in these structures that are basically one-room homes constructed with tin or with wood, and some people have lived there for more than a decade, while others have just recently arrived. And the vast majority of those people are receiving help in some way from the United States.
Rachel Chasen is the Post's West Africa bureau chief. She says this camp estimates it gets 30% of its funding from the United States. Or at least it did. On the first day of his new administration, President Donald Trump signed an executive order freezing almost all foreign aid for 90 days. After the aid freeze was announced, Rachel spoke to the coordinator of the Embera refugee camp, a man named Mohammed Ag Malhad. She asked him how the funding freeze would impact the camp.
Dommage en matière de livelihood, dommage en matière d'éducation, dommage en matière de santé, dommage en matière de coexistence pacifique.
So what Mohammed told us was that some of the funding cuts were virtually immediate. It was the day after the announcement that a school learned that it was going to stop receiving funding. There were programs for social psychologists that were cut. There were even art therapy programs for children who'd experienced trauma that were cut. He also said that there's this massive sort of looming fear about what comes next, whether it's in terms of food, in terms of the infrastructure for the camp, the basic things that really keep it running. So he said that there's a panic.
Donc, il y a une panique.
Panic is a strong word, but I have chosen it. It's the word that suits.
Le mot panique, il est très fort, mais je l'ai choisi parce que c'est le mot qu'il faut. Il y a une panique. Nous paniquons dans les camps.
We are panicking in the camp. He told me that in the camp, they're sure that if American aid doesn't start again, the gap will have really serious consequences.
This camp and other places like it around the world are caught up in the crosshairs of a major political battle unfolding in the U.S. President Donald Trump and his ally Elon Musk have tried to seriously roll back foreign assistance around the world. A lot of their attention has been focused on the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. This is the agency that coordinates a lot of U.S. foreign aid, and Trump and Musk have been working to shut it down. Hundreds of workers have been put on leave, and programs that provide food and medical assistance have been paused. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has issued exemptions for life-saving programs, but there's been confusion on the ground, and many organizations say they haven't gotten those waivers. This is all part of Trump's agenda to use the executive office to remake the federal workforce and how the government spends money.
Trump and his allies have really promised to make sure that every dollar provides a tangible benefit for American voters.
Missy Ryan writes about national security and defense for The Post.
And in this sense, USAID does seem like an obvious target because the agency is tasked with, helping others in order to advance American foreign policy interests and also to advance sort of soft power throughout the world. And so what we're seeing right now is the manifestation of all of those things coming together.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Wednesday, February 12th. Today, why President Donald Trump and Elon Musk are trying to dismantle USAID, the legal roadblocks they're running into along the way, and what the impacts could be if they are actually successful. Missy spoke to my co-host Martine Powers. I'll let Martine take it from here.
So, Missy, before we dig into more of why and how USAID has become this target of President Trump, I want to understand a little bit more about this agency. Where did it come from? How long has it been around? What does USAID do?
The U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USAID or USAID, was founded in 1961 under President Kennedy.
Permits us to exert influence for the maintenance of freedom. If we were not so heavily involved, our voice would not speak with such vigor.
And the goal was to be the sort of foreign assistance arm of the U.S. government, advance American interest by projecting this kind of soft power, by providing assistance in line with American interests and in line with American values, which were to, help the world's poorest, provide assistance in strategic areas of the world. And there have been moments over the past decades where it actually has been the subject of discussion whether or not it would be collapsed into the State Department, whether or not it was the most effective tool. There's been talk of reform for many years, both Republicans and Democrats. So it does have, it has its ups and downs over the course of recent decades, but it has been a sort of critical face for the American government that people who, never traveled to the United States might encounter in a way that generally is positive, providing food assistance, providing assistance for education, for other sorts of programs. So it was surprising to me that President Trump and Musk went after it as aggressively as they could.
Mm-hmm. And just to talk about that, I mean, so this is an agency that right now, or up until recently, had more than 10,000 employees, more than 6,000 of whom are overseas. Why did USAID become a target for Donald Trump? And can you kind of take us back to that first day in office? How did this start that USAID was on the chopping block?
Well, the first thing that happened is that there was an executive order talking about reexamining and realigning foreign assistance with the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy and its sort of worldview. So that came out, and it seemed fairly limited at the time. The first EO actually mentioned development assistance, which is one subset of overall foreign assistance. And so it seemed like it might be a sort of modest step to reexamine and potentially put stuff on hold. But then quickly we saw it expand in scope, expand in the ambition of these steps affecting USAID, including a much broader freeze that came out in the first few days of the Trump administration, followed by steps to put, now we know, more than 2,000 USAID personnel on leave globally. And so it really seemed quite quickly that it went from being a review, a reexamination, to shutting the agency down. And, a lot of that was we were hearing from Elon Musk himself, who has come in as first an unofficial advisor and I guess now an official government employee, talking about putting USAID in the wood chipper, saying it must die, calling it a criminal organization.
Yeah, it does seem like he has a almost personal fixation with USAID, and it's unclear why. Like, why is it that Elon Musk has specifically, of all the government agencies that he could view as overfunded or, in need of aggressive cutting, like, why is USAID kind of an obsession for him now?
It was surprising to me, too. Some of our colleagues here at The Post wrote an interesting article talking about what appears to have been the pivotal influence of a conservative activist named Mike Benz, who went on Joe Rogan's podcast and sort of described USAID in conspiratorial terms, in my view, because he talked about it being a CIA front agency, about it, sort of hijacking government money, things like that.
USAID is effectively a switch player to assist the Pentagon with on the national security front, to assist the State Department on the national interest front, or to assist the intelligence community on a sort of clandestine operations front.
And Musk seems to have picked up on that. And, it's in line with his management style, to kind of slash and burn, and also with the Trump team's overall desire to cut federal spending, to have a sort of anti-institutional bent, if you will. But frankly, USAID was never an agency that was widely discussed as a target for cutting during the first Trump administration. And I actually spoke with USAID employees who said they were relieved when Rubio was picked as Secretary of State because he does have a history of speaking up for the value of foreign assistance on the Hill.
We don't have to give foreign aid. We do so because it furthers our national interest. That's why we give foreign aid. Now,
and so, there's a lot of speculation about how widely the level of intensity of the steps that we're seeing against USAID, how wide the support for that is within the administration. But certainly it's something that, got Trump's support. Elon Musk talked in one video that he posted online about, how he double-checked with Donald Trump before he oversaw this process to reduce the USAID workforce.
So really none of this could be done without the full support of the president. With regard to the USAID stuff, I went over it with him, in detail, and he agreed with that we should shut it down.
That he was making sure this had Trump's stamp of approval.
Yeah, and Trump has actually spoken in support of it since then.
When you look at USAID, that's a fraud. The whole thing is a fraud. Very little being put to good use. Every single line that I look at in terms of events and transactions is either corrupt or ridiculous.
And it's interesting because now we've seen a lot of Republicans on the Hill, especially, even those in crucial oversight positions over the State Department and USAID, talk about the need to conduct kind of significant reforms and potentially dissolve the agency. And that's been surprising to me as well, because we didn't hear a lot about that previously. I mean, even many Democrats will say it needed to be reformed. But the fact that congressional Republicans are falling in line with this idea that it could go away is not something that was widely discussed, at least in this high-profile way previously.
Yeah, I want to understand more about that, because you had mentioned that this question of whether there needed to be reform for USAID, that's not a new question, that there had been conversations in the past decades about potentially folding it into the State Department. So first, I want to ask, what are the legitimate criticisms of USAID or of how USAID operates or the work that they do?
Yeah, I think that there is criticism about efficiency and red tape and whether or not, it's a large bureaucracy and it operates subject to lots and lots of congressionally imposed restrictions. And, for example, it provides a lot of food aid, but it does so, as I understand it, it's the only sort of major food aid donor that provides the bulk of its assistance in kind, which means actually shipping wheat and rice overseas, which is not particularly efficient. It's much more efficient to give cash. And that is done because that is an arrangement that we've had for a long time to help the American farm sector. There are lots of...
So there's a question of would it be cheaper to just buy food in these places and pay for it there rather than shipping all this stuff from the US?
I think you see the same kind of questions being raised about, in any sort of aid activity about overhead, about dollars reaching beneficiaries. But, that's an active debate and, people make arguments on both sides. What is surprising to me is that the conversation went from that to putting it in the wood chipper within the space of a week.
And thinking about the financial stakes of that, our understanding now is that USAID has a portfolio of about $40 billion of programs. And if that is cut from the federal government spending, how big of an impact could that have in the grand scheme of things? I mean, President Trump and Elon Musk are saying they want to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. So will these USAID cuts actually make a significant difference in terms of saving America a meaningful amount of money?
Foreign assistance represents 1% of the federal budget, so I don't think it makes a big difference there. But I do think that it does make a big difference to the beneficiaries, as Rachel heard in the camp that she was in Mauritania. And it does make a difference in soft power. I think that the United States, one of the primary tools that it has used for 70 years to get other countries to get on board with what it wants to have happen, is that it uses this foreign assistance as a leverage point. And I think that there's a big question now about how we've eroded, or we would erode, that status if all of those programs go away.
After the break, Missy and Martine talk about how a shutdown of USAID could impact the U.S.'s standing around the world. We'll be right back.
My name is Tom Sietsema, and I am the food critic for The Washington Post. I think a lot of great restaurant meals are like great books, films, or concerts. You don't necessarily need them to live, but don't they make life more worth living? I see myself as sort of a reader advocate going in there, spending the Post's money, coming back and giving you the green light, yield sign, or a stop sign. I like to be seen as sort of the best friend who happens to eat out a lot more than they do. I eat in about 10 restaurants a week. And I like creating memories for people and helping them create memories, whether those are first date, a 50th anniversary, grandma's 90th birthday, if you have special needs, whether they're dietary or otherwise. When you subscribe to The Washington Post, you support this kind of journalism. Learn more at subscribe.washingtonpost.com. I'm Tom Sietsema, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
So, Missy, let's talk a little bit more about the current status of USAID right now, because we've all seen these headlines of the prospect of layoffs for all of these employees, programs being canceled. What exactly is the state of USAID right now? Like, does it still functionally exist?
It does. I should just back up a moment to say that the largest share of the workforce are actually foreign service nationals, as they're called. So they're the local employees in USAID missions all over the world. And we know nothing about what's supposed to happen to them. The reason why those people have not been furloughed, fired, or put on leave as most of the American direct hire people, the people directly hired by the government or the contractors, the reason why those people have not been touched is that local labor laws don't permit that. But you have to assume that, they might be fired at the end of this period or when, local labor laws would allow. So there's about 600 USAID employees who have been categorized as necessary employees to be retained. And these are people who oversee contacts directly. They're like the IT people. They're the management people. So there's 600 people who are in that category. And then there were 2,000 people who were put on administrative leave over the course of about 10 days after the Trump administration took office. There was a court order last Friday that reinstated them for the time being until this Friday, actually, and stopped the Trump administration from putting another 2,000 or so people who are at USAID missions all over the world on administrative leave as well, and ordering them to come back to the United States.
So it seems like things are very much still in a state of flux, like that there are these plans that have been put out there by the Trump administration to effectively get rid of USAID, but that at this moment, because some of the stuff is held up in court, you have thousands of people who are waiting to see whether or not they're going to be able to keep their jobs.
Yeah, these people are in limbo, and the Trump administration is arguing for the courts to allow them to proceed with their plans to at least put people on leave. The expectation among many of the people that I've been speaking with is that they will eventually be laid off through like the reduction in force process is what is called in the government. But then there's also the possibility that they leave it standing in name only and that they, gut the workforce and the programs and move what's remaining within the State Department where it would be more tightly under the control of Rubio.
Why? Like, what would be the benefit of that? Or why would it matter whether USAID is its own thing or whether it's under the State Department?
There are a couple things. I think just putting it under the State Department puts it more directly under the control of the Secretary of State. It presumably depletes its bureaucratic power, its staff, its resources if it's within the State Department. And it also would be a response to these accusations that we've heard from Musk and others, which is that USAID is a rogue agency, that it has acted against the interests of the American government, of this administration, certainly, and that it hasn't been responsive to Congress and what, its oversight committees have asked it to do. And frankly, I haven't heard a lot of detail from Republicans about what that is. So maybe we will hear more from lawmakers and certainly from the agency itself, especially as they're having to come forward and defend their actions in court.
I want to talk more about the potential consequences here. You described a little bit of the ways that USAID funding affects people right now. Can you paint a picture of some of the places where this money makes a difference and that if things go forward and these programs are permanently halted, that it could have a real impact on people's lives?
Yeah, well, we were talking earlier about how the foreign assistance represents only 1% of the U.S. budget, but the United States is still the largest donor by far globally. And so you're looking at a world where there's a huge gap in funding and nobody else can really step into that void. I'll just give you an example. The United States has been a huge donor in Gaza since the beginning of the conflict there, the largest donor. And, there's been all sorts of challenges that you and I have discussed previously about getting aid in. But since the ceasefire took effect last month, there's been an effort to try to surge in now that there's more permissible conditions to get the aid in. And even though Rubio issued a broad humanitarian waiver shortly after Trump took office, that hasn't actually led to most of the humanitarian programs or many of them being restarted. And that's for several sort of reasons. I think one was just chaos and people not knowing what was happening. The Trump administration issued a waiver, but at the same time said every program, every implementing partner, these are, aid groups essentially, has to wait to have affirmative confirmation from USAID that each program can proceed. And that is a process that without a lot of staff, it was really hard for USAID to move forward with. So
it sounds like that aid that is supposed to be going to Gaza in this moment, that has been held up in part because of all this flux, even if the Trump administration hasn't explicitly said that they're cutting aid to Gaza.
Yeah. And so, some of that is slowly coming back online now. Gaza, some food aid in the last few days. People have started to get the green light, which they needed to proceed. But at the same time, USAID's payment system has largely been frozen since January 20th. And that means that grantees who work with USAID have not been able to draw down funds that they need to, pay truck drivers to ship aid or to pay their employees, and contractors can't get reimbursed. And so you're seeing this sort of bureaucratic deadlock that, may be a result of, people stepping in without knowledge of the bureaucracy, or maybe a result of understaffing. But the bottom line is that even though there's an intention to shelter this one sort of core component of American foreign assistance, it has not actually worked out that way.
I want to come back to something else you mentioned earlier, which I think a lot of Americans aren't aware of, that part of USAID, and I think what some people would argue with the benefits that it provides, is that this is also a source of revenue for American farmers, that American farmers are being paid for their crops that are getting sent over to places where we're trying to help feed people. Can you tell me about how some of those farmers and those businesses here in the U.S. have reacted and how they've been affected by all this?
In 2020, the U.S. government bought $2.1 billion in food aid from American farmers. So that's a lot of, bags of wheat, bags of rice that are being put onto ships at ports and going overseas. According to the Washington Post that we reported earlier this week, purchases and shipments of U.S. food aid worth over $300 million have been paused. Hundreds of thousands of tons of American food aid, just sitting there, potentially perishing. So I do think that is one of the real costs to this. And so I think that, one of the questions that people have had with the way this is being conducted is, you could have a desire to conduct a review, to suspend programs, to, discontinue certain activities. But
like go about reform in a more methodical or intentional way.
The way that it's being rolled out has created a lot of chaos and potentially some waste as well. You have to think that there could have been a more efficient way to go about doing this.
Missy, you described it earlier that this is part of the Trump administration's America First strategy, and that the argument that we're hearing from Trump administration officials right now is that, look, this money is better spent on helping Americans, making America safer. This isn't money that we should just be sending abroad to everybody else to help them, and that we have to be kind of looking out for our own first. But you talked about how in some cases, in many cases, there's an argument that all of this international aid is in America's interest. It's in our national security interests. Can you talk a little bit about the risks here of shuttering USAID beyond just how it'll affect people abroad, but how it could also affect the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem is it's hard to quantify the value of the goodwill that American foreign assistance has purchased the United States over decades. And it's, I, having worked overseas for a long time, have no doubt that that is one of the reasons why countries, want to partner with the United States, why countries are willing to go along with certain things that they don't necessarily like. It's one of the tools that the United States has used. For example, if a country has a human rights policy that, that the U.S. doesn't like, and, putting that aid on the table is, an important point of leverage. A lot of people who are opposing the current cuts are talking about how this could potentially allow China to step into the void. China doesn't give the same kind of foreign aid that the United States does, but it has a lot of investments, massive investments in infrastructure in the developing world, and the United States doesn't do that right now. And so the foreign assistance has been the vehicle for buying that goodwill and projecting the soft power. And so you have to question whether or not this could actually open the door to greater Chinese influence in strategic areas of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and the like.
So I know that at this point, there's a lot that we're waiting to see how it plays out in the courts in terms of whether some of these staffers will be able to keep their jobs. Tell me about what are you looking out for in the coming days and weeks to see how all of this progresses, and really like whether USAID continues to exist in one form or another, or whether it's basically gone.
Yeah, I think the most immediate thing I'm going to be looking at is the outcome of this court process. There's been a challenge by two organizations representing federal employees, whether or not the judge decides to allow the Trump administration to go ahead with putting people on leave and potentially laying them off. And then, on a more medium-term basis, I think at the end of, there's a couple things. At the end of the 90-day pause, how many of the programs that existed previously are reinstated and how many are terminated? And then the fate of USAID, if it is folded into the State Department, either formally or just, in practice, most of the remaining staff and programs, what role does this play? Does the United States decide to pivot to a different notion for foreign assistance? They try to partner with the private sector more. Do we only do humanitarian aid? Do we only fund particular UN agencies that work with children, that work in food aid, and we walk away from a lot of the educational, democracy and governance, social kinds of programs that the United States has had? So I think that the programmatic, the nature and the scope of the programs, I think is going to tell us a lot at the end of the day. I think, and that'll probably take 6 months to a year to play out.
Missy, thank you so much for explaining all this.
Thank you.
Missy Ryan covers national security and defense for The Post. She spoke to my co-host Martine Powers. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky. It was edited by Peter Bresnan with help from Lucy Perkins and mixed by Sam Baer. Thanks to Catherine Hereld and Amy Fiskus. Thanks also to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum for the audio you heard of Kennedy speaking about USAID. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.